The morning smelled of metal and cold dust. Light came thin through a lattice of broken roofs. Through a slit in the ruined third floor, she could see a roofline of chimneys and the pale smear of a river beyond. Someone somewhere had lit a stove. Smoke moved in a low ribbon and carried the taste of burned rations. She held the rifle against her cheek and felt the weight of it as if it were an extension of her arm, familiar, precise, unwilling to lie. Before the story begins, one small request. If you find this account worth your time, like and subscribe and stay until the end. There is a reason this name and these tactics matter. Share the video so these choices, the good and the reckless, do not vanish from memory. She had been called reckless often enough that the label had stopped hurting. The men who judged from billets and maps could not smell shell smoke, could not learn the rhythm of a ruined block as she did. To them, her moves looked like gambling. To the young women who watched her, they looked like experiments with survival. It was June, the shell of the city sagging under heat. The date mattered in maps and logs, but what mattered in the slit was calculation. She measured the angle by the edge of the broken window, adjusted her tamped wad of cloth in the stock to a comfortable cheek weld, and set the crosshair on a shape against a far wall, a dark rectangle that might be a man or might be a shadow. Her spotter, Pelageya, who had a scar at the jaw and hands that never stopped worrying rope, half-turned in the next room and held up 2 fingers, the agreed signal for no change. The rhythm of their work had become shorthand. Breath, aim, exhale, send. She squeezed, and the report rolled out thin and quick, swallowed almost immediately by the city. There was the expected hollow sound as the pellet hit brick, then silence. The shape crumpled where it stood, not glorious, not cinematic, simply a gap where someone had been. She felt nothing at the instant but the precise settling of a job completed. Later, the face would return in dreams. Reconstruction note: conversations and interior fragments are dramatized for clarity, where no direct contemporary transcript survives. She was 22 when she learned to treat shots as equations. The first term was wind, small, cruel, shifting even inside the shell. The second was distance. The third, the sag of the rifle under heat and fatigue. And the fourth was the human variable, the tendency of targets to move when they expect to be safe. She kept a pocket notebook and had drawn little graphs on the inside cover, a childish habit that became a tool. On a page she wrote a rule that would later be cited by men in longer coats as if it were simple doctrine. Never take a shot that did not give you new information. Kill the man, yes, preferably, but gather the map of the enemy with every action. She had not wanted the rifle at first. She had been a student of history and numbers, the sort who calculated trajectories for fun. War changed calculation into currency. Grief turned curiosity into a mission. Her brother had been taken in the early months, killed in a counterattack whose objective had been ill-defined. In a grainy photograph she kept in the pocket of her greatcoat, his eyes were open and stupidly young. When she pressed her thumb to the glass, it felt like contact with the past, like an accusation. She enlisted because numbers told her the front needed another pair of precise eyes. She stayed because she realized the work could be pushed from individual kills into patterns that saved lives in bulk. Training came in the small hours and the large, terrible days. An instructor named Mikhail at the range had cursed her for firing too quickly, then cursed himself when she corrected his crosswind estimate. In quieter moments, after a day that tasted of cordite and the metallic tang of fear, they sat and compared notes and talked about the little adjustments that made a shot clean. The unit had scant respect for a woman who refused to be ornamental. Respect came when she started returning the men who sent her out with answers. Her first tactical insight was practical and ugly. The front punished predictable nests. Snipers who occupied the same window for days on end became targets not only for their opposite numbers, but for artillery and infiltration. She started to move. She learned to make a position sing, leave traces that suggested presence where there was none, so that the enemy would waste attention clearing what did not exist. They called it decoy work. Then she called it chess. Technical note: a decoy, in this context, is a deliberate false position. Loose clothes stuffed with straw, a reflector placed at a certain angle to mimic the glint of optics, a trail of footprints, intended to draw enemy observation and fire toward a worthless target and thus reveal their positions or waste their resources. She taught others how to leave a knitted scarf in a window to suggest a sentry had dozed, how to rig a broken rifle barrel into a shutter so a passing observer would glance and assume a shooter, how to move like a shadow between ruins and practice silence as a weapon. These were improvisations born of necessity. There were no manuals for the manpower and material shortage they faced, and their effect rippled. A squad that learned to read the decoys could channel enemy efforts into choke points and ambushes. They could bleed an attack before it reached the supply lines. But her idea of baiting the enemy with herself, the self-bait technique, was different from stuffed shirts and fake rifles. It was an ethical and personal gamble. It required her to become conspicuous on purpose, to present a surface of vulnerability large enough and tempting enough to coax the concealed into revealing their jaws. The commanding officers called it reckless when she proposed it. The men on the ground called it brave. The difference was in proximity. Those who had never watched a company die under a misread approach line found it easy to censoriously mutter "at risk." Those who had learned to count their dead by names found risk a tool, not a vice. Her experiments began with small things. She would step into a street with an obviously visible white scarf, white in a war where white meant surrender at best, or leave a kettle boiling on a visible windowsill and see how quickly someone took notice. The first few times the enemy responded slowly. They were cautious. Some patrols walked around the wrong flank. Once, Pelagia's younger brother was wounded because of a misinterpreted bait. She never forgave herself for that. Loss taught her humility. Loss made the techniques precise. Tactical aside, self-baiting is high risk and only useful when integrated into a broader defensive plan. It should be used when friendly units can capitalize immediately on the enemy's changed posture, e.g. sweeping fire from pre-positioned machine guns, pre-sighted mortars, or a prepared counterattack. Without a coordinated support plan, self-baiting becomes a gratuitous sacrifice. By the winter after she had first taken a rifle, she had a small reputation. Word traveled on the front lines differently than in papers. It spread through murmurs, through the small cigarettes passed in dugouts, through whispered instructions behind the reinforced doors of command posts. Enemy propaganda tried to turn names into monsters. Their posters used a single photograph and called it a story. The truth sat somewhere between. She was effective, and that effectiveness had started to change how a sector was defended. Her unit was stationed in a band of ruined apartment blocks that formed an L around a small rail junction. The enemy, for reasons of their own, wanted the junction reopened. They could not afford a long campaign. Their commanders preferred swift, decisive actions. An assault force had assembled on the outskirts, infantry with a few light tanks for psychological effect. They would attempt to push through under cover of a morning mist that the meteorologists' clerks in rear lines had optimistically called fog. The morning that would be remembered as both folly and salvation began with reconnaissance. A squad from the opposing force moved in a shapeless line through a smoke-stained orchard, probing. She watched them from the attic of a collapsed bakery. She could see the glint of 2 rifles through the steam. She could see their false confidence. They had not yet learned the L's geometry. Her plan, if it could be called that, was not a plan so much as a series of small probabilities stacked into a single bet.
She would cross the open square between the bakery and the block opposite, carrying nothing but a thermos and a white scarf looped around her neck. There would be no attempt to hide.
The point was to be noticed, clearly and early. She and Pelageya had arranged with a nearby machine gun crew. When the enemy revealed their position by firing on her, the guns would sweep the expected approach lanes, and the infantry in a prepared trench would drop in with grenades. It was, in the cold arithmetic, a way of turning enemy fire back into a path of defeat. The commanding officer murmured something about losing good soldiers and penciled disapproval in the log. She scribbled, quietly, a counter to his numbers in the edge of the map. Probability of revealing 2 nests. Probability of diversion success. Casualty estimate. They were the language she spoke. She moved in the gray before dawn. The square looked, from the middle of it, like a mouth of rubble. A cart lay on its side, its wheel pitted and sharp as a saw. The river's fog wrapped the distant chimneys in softness. She walked with light, purposeful steps. She never ran. Footsteps had a tempo. Running would have been panic and would have made the enemy cautious. She wanted the enemy to think themselves in control. When the first rifle barked from a rooftop across the rail, it was not aimed at her. It was aimed where they expected an important target to be, around the railway maintenance shed. A second report cracked from the west. The enemy had taken the bait. The machine gun crew, previously instructed to watch specific arcs, opened up in a long, flat burst that painted a trajectory across the orchard and into the debris line where attackers would funnel. Men dropped, and the assault gave way to the noises of confusion, yells, thudding bodies, the harsh churn of a tank trying to find a firm grip among rubble. There, in the center, she froze and turned very slightly so that she could see the flashes that had betrayed the enemy shooters. 2 positions, both more exposed than she had dared hope. One was a half-roofed balcony behind the red brick of a small school. The other was a bell tower, or what remained of one, over the western side of the junction, a favorite of enemy sharpshooters for its height and field of view. She did not raise her rifle. She had already wasted enough of the enemy's attention. Instead, she put the white scarf over her head as if to keep warm, and cupped her hands and screamed. A human sound, terrified and human. It drew the shooter's focus like a magnet. Bullets thudded around her, but they were not intended to hit her. They were intended to stop the visible nuisance. In that second, she knew the azimuth of the shooters by the angle of the incoming fire and the shadows they threw. Technical note: triangulation in urban settings can be quickly achieved by observing the angle of incoming fire, the time delay of sound, and the visible muzzle flashes. When 2 distinct arcs intersect in a predictable geometry, a defender can estimate the enemy firing positions with surprising accuracy. Short, handwritten diagrams were common in field notes. The machine guns reoriented. Pelageya, at the second window, flashed a prearranged mirror signal and then a white cloth. A runner moved to cut off the enemy's flank. The defenses closed like a trap that had been set months earlier with small improvisations, cleared sight lines, pre-calculated arcs, wedges of grenades stashed in reachable corners. The attackers lost cohesion. The tank's driver, seeing infantry fall, overcompensated and jammed the treads on a collapsed tram, making itself an immobile target. The attack dissolved. Men fled into the ruins, some seeking cover, some seeking the river. Among the retreating was a group of officers, a small knot moving as if to reform a plan. One of them, whom later accounts would call the Phantom of the Bell Tower, an epithet used in enemy leaflets and by soldiers on both sides, was later believed to have been the best sharpshooter in the assault. The machine guns found him by the arc of his fire. When he moved to another coal-scarred window, she had him in sight. There was a relative pause then, a stilled breath in the city, and she squeezed. He fell where he stood, in a shock of stunned rubble. The presence that had guided the assault collapsed. The enemy streamed away, leaving weapons and a ragged pride.
It was in all the reports as an oddity. An entire attack ended because a single figure had made what looked like the dumbest move possible, walking openly across a square with a white scarf. There were consequences. For a few days, the commanding officers argued. For a few days, the gossipers on the front called her suicide-minded. Then, when the logs were tabulated and the bodies inventoried, the result was clear. An attack had been disrupted with fewer friendly casualties than predicted. When the enemy tried the same approach again in a different sector, they met a defense that anticipated them. The lesson had been transmitted. She paid a price. In the scramble after the assault, she was struck, not fatally, but hard enough that the medics at the nearby aid post found a hairline fracture along her rib and a blow to the shoulder. They bandaged her and wrote into the margins that she should be evacuated. She argued. Pelagia, fingers gentle as draft lines, held her hand and refused to let the argument stand. The unit's log recommended she be pulled back to recover. Command decided to send her not only to convalesce, but also, later, to travel to several cities to demonstrate defensive tactics and to speak, an uncomfortable mixture of recognition and exploitation. The duel in the bell tower, the instant that later became compressed into legend, deserves particular technical attention because it encapsulated both her tactical mind and the brutal simplicity of close-range sharpshooting. The tower offered height and field of view. It also offered limited maneuverability for the man inside. He had a curved field but narrow windows.
To force him out, she created a second problem. He could not defend both the western approach and his immediate doorway. She used a fake sending of supplies. A burlap sack dropped from the adjacent roof with a trail of freshly smoked breadcrumbs to suggest a supply line. Then she staged 2 shots 50 meters apart at angles that would draw his eyes. When he moved to correct, she saw the flash and placed the third precise shot. It was not poetry, it was geometry and timing. Analysis aside, bell towers in urban fighting are double-edged. They give shooters vertical dominance, but constrain escape routes and complicate close defense. For any shooter, exposure in a tower is compensated by the ability to see and command, but it also makes triangulation easier if the enemy can observe muzzle flashes and direction. The tactic of forcing an elevated shooter into lateral movement before a decisive shot is a standard counter to the tower problem. Evacuation did not remove the noise of the front from her thoughts. Between shifts at the convalescent station and forced speeches on platforms where the applause felt like a ledger entry, she had time to think and remember, and to be told by propaganda scribes that she had become an icon. They photographed her cradling a rifle and printed her smile as if it were an award. She hated the photographs. They made her look like someone who loved the tool rather than someone who used it out of terrible necessity. After the wound healed, she was not returned immediately to frontline duty. Instead, she was asked to organize a small school of marksmanship for new recruits, women and men alike, teaching the procedures she had built in trial and hazard. The curriculum she drafted, in those early cramped classrooms, contained both moral admonitions and blunt technical points. How to calculate wind, how to use decoys, how to coordinate with machine gun arcs, when to bait and when to hold. She emphasized the ethics of self-bait. It was, she said simply, a last resort for when other options had failed and only when friendly assets could act within the same heartbeat. Her students were young and eager and terrified. One of them, a thin-faced boy who could not stop whistling under stress, asked her, during a training lull, if she regretted her brother. She looked at him for a long time and then answered, voice low, "Regret is its own weight. You carry it, and either you sink or you use it to push forward." He did not understand the calculus then. Later, many of them would. The doctrine she helped codify began to seed across sectors. Officers in distant command posts read the reports and incorporated diagrams into manuals. Her self-baiting was not written as a universal precept. It remained a conditional tactic, footnoted with warnings. But the language changed.
Commanders began to speak of fixing enemy nests rather than merely killing individual shooters. The effect of that rhetorical shift was not abstract.
It changed how units allocated resources, and it saved lives in measured counts. She returned to the blocks for brief times, because some methods needed the raw feeling of ruin to remain sharp. And she carried with her a small photograph, her brother's younger face folded into a winter coat, eyes blunt with youth. The photograph became a touchstone. She kept it in the butt of her rifle in a leather fold, away from prying fingers and curiosity. Sometimes, in the stillness after a watch, she would pull it out and read the face like scripture. Not all accepted the lessons. There were men who continued to see risk differently, who could not reconcile a tactic that required what looked like a deliberate exposure with the imperative to preserve the individual. The front carried 1,000 small fights like this one, between doctrine and improvisation, between order and the momentary chaos of need. She learned to present her data and to let the results speak louder than her words. The duel that erased the Phantom Sniper's reputation was reduced by storytellers to a single sentence in later years. The dumbest move ended an entire attack. That label both amused and infuriated her. It implied a simple bravery or a stroke of mad luck. The truth was always messier. It was calculated risk, supported by coordination and informed by a ledger of losses. The enemy's decision to commit to open fire on an apparently harmless figure revealed their own assumptions. The defenders exploited them. That is how battles end, through the exploitation of mistakes as much as through momentary heroism. After the war, when histories were written and memorials raised, her name appeared in some lists and not in others. The rifle with the leather fold was placed, briefly, in a local collection. Photographs were framed beside larger portraits of generals and ministers. The scale tended to dwarf the small human face. She did not know whether she wanted to be famous. Fame shifted the focus away from the mechanics of survival to the spectacle of the person. The moral cost remained. She woke at night with the echo of that day, a recurring loop in which the crosshairs hung heavy over a small, bright target. She dreamed of faces, the phantom in the tower, Pelagia's brother with his arm half hidden under a blanket, the boys who had not learned how to read a map. Memory in the post-war years was not a comfortable thing. It was a ledger kept by a body that refused simple reconciliation. In private, she kept refining her methods on paper, making the diagrams cleaner and labeling arcs and angles in ink. She wrote notes on when a self-bait should be used and when it should be forbidden. Her notes were practical and without heroics, the equations of risk and support. The men who later drew on her work did so because it fit the calculus of survival. She had wanted merely to make a life for herself and for others. Less precarious. Years later, a small boy visiting an exhibit would point to a photograph of a woman with a white scarf and ask his mother why she had walked in the square. The mother would tell a simplified version, perhaps the story of a brave woman who fooled the enemy. The short version is not a lie, only an omission. The full truth sits in the margins, that the move looked dumb to those who could not see the map she had sketched in her head, that it ended an attack because other people who were ready and listening did their part, that it left marks that could not be photographed. Her legacy lives in diagrams and in the way snipers and defenders in subsequent conflicts considered deception a tool of survival. It lives in the small ribbon sometimes tucked into a display case beside a rifle, a ribbon not of triumph but of memory. It lives in the quiet rooms where veterans meet and speak in low cadences about choices they made and what they would do again and what they would not. That morning in the ruined bakery remained a hinge in her life. She left the square with the weight of the rifle and the small regret that never left her. The next dawn would ask her to teach what she knew, to stand on platforms and explain geometry to people who had not smelled smoke, to sit with Pelagia in the thin light and try to sleep. The next dawn would also bring other attacks somewhere else, and in those places the lessons would be applied with varying degrees of mercy. She learned what many at the front learned the hard way, that tactics were not merely machines for killing, but instruments that, when used with care, could preserve life by redirecting the destructive energy of the enemy. There is a line between bravery and foolhardiness, and it was her constant work to keep that line thin and honest. When the tours ended and the applause faded, she returned to a quieter life, one in which the rifle was no longer a daily companion, but an artifact of a necessary past. The photograph of her brother went to a small box in a drawer. People who had fought with her still came by, offering silence more than words. They would sit, sometimes, and reconstruct events with the tenderness of people who had seen too much and wanted the record to be fair. For historians, the story remained useful because it illustrated an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the move which looks the most reckless is the one that breaks an enemy's rhythm and saves more lives than it costs. That does not make the move heroic by default. It makes it human, risky, and subject to moral scrutiny. The dumbest move was less a moment of pure daring than a practical focus of design, coordination, and the willingness to accept personal danger for a larger protective pattern. She died, eventually, old enough to see the city repaired in some places and left in ruin in others. The official records preserved dates and sparse citations. Friends kept photographs and memories. The rifle, the scarf, and the notebook went to different places, some into collections, some into basements, and each keeper told the story according to the tendency of memory, to cast things in light if they were proud, to soften them if they were ashamed. In the end, the image that seemed to hold everything was small and stubborn. Her hand, dirt under its nails, fingers curled around a photograph. The photograph had the young face of her brother, and when she held it up to the light, the glass caught the sun and split it into small shards. It was, in the simplest terms, an emblem, what she had fought for and what she had paid to protect. The narrative of the dumbest move traveled beyond the front lines because it confirmed what commanders and poets both secretly wished to be true, that a single decision, a single brave or foolish act, could change the course of many. But the full story, with its margins and diagrams and quiet costs, remained in the notebooks and the scars. That is where the real teaching was, not in celebrating a simple gambit, but in understanding the infrastructure of support that made such gambits survivable. She understood, better than most, that memory must be preserved with care. The tactical manuals that included her notes were practical artifacts. The stories told in kitchens and barracks were the living archive. Both were necessary. She had found a way to turn calculation into protection, and in doing so she had altered not just a single attack, but part of the language of frontline defense. When the city sent a committee to inventory relics for a new collection, the curator asked her for the rifle and the tiny notebook. She handed them over with a small reluctance. "Keep the notes honest," she told him, reconstructed. "Don't sell the stories as simple heroism. Remember the support that made them work." He nodded, not perhaps fully grasping the difference. The machine gun crew that had swung its barrels in the square years before came by to see the display. The old driver of the tank came too, his face furrowed by roads still. They looked at the photograph, at the scarf, at the notes, and then they sat in the small sunlit room and talked, not in public lines, but in the private grammar of veterans, and passed the memory back and forth so it would not harden into legend. There is a temptation, in retelling such moments, to frame them as inevitable, that a single move had to end the attack. History rarely offers such neatness. The move worked because of calculation, because of coordination, because of those who took their positions and held them when the enemy erred. Recklessness did not win the day alone. It was the spark that set alight a prepared tinderbox. The lesson applies beyond war. Strategy without support is vanity. Courage without coordination is a story to be mourned. She lived long enough to see some of her students become instructors themselves. Once, in a quiet corridor, a young woman approached her and pressed into her hand a small scrap of cloth, white at the edge, frayed. She did not need to ask what it meant. The gesture was both continuity and admonition. The scrap would be used in training, a reminder that visibility can be a weapon when sharpened with care. The crosshair, then, in all its metaphoric weight, was not merely a sign of targeting. It became a symbol of focus, on consequence, on support, and on the moral costs that bind them. Photographs would show her in profile, the rifle under her cheek, and viewers would make up meanings. The more important archive, however, remained the diagram she left behind, small, stoic, and unromantic. In the final inventory of her life, the dumbest move is not the whole story. It is a hinge, a teaching moment, a way to understand how improvisation can be disciplined and how mortal risk can sometimes be converted into collective safety. That conversion never absolves the individual from the cost. The price was paid in sleepless nights and in faces that returned unbidden. Yet the calculus she made, balancing loss and protection, using visibility as a lever, changed practices, and, for some, spared senseless death. She walked once more through the square late in life, when many of the broken roofs had been patched and the tram lines relaid. Children played among the newly planted trees, and did not know the geometry of arcs and angles that had once governed the space. She stopped at the center and touched the place where a cartwheel had lain. She did not recount the numbers aloud. She folded her hands and closed her eyes, and for a moment the city returned to its older music. The distant hammer, the low river murmur, the imagined soft report of a rifle in a distant attic. Someone nearby, one of the guides at the small municipal collection, recognized her and offered a respectful bow that had become the ritual for veterans. She accepted it with a small nod. She thought of the notebooks she had given away, the students she had taught, the men and women who had held their arcs in the days when her tactics were new. She thought of the photograph and of the boy who had asked her about regret. She thought of probability and of love and of waste. And she realized that no single move could be reduced to praise or censure. The city moved on around her, indifferent to legends and scars alike. That was perhaps a mercy. The story remained for those who wanted to study it, a lesson in risk, in the architecture of defense, and in the stubborn, terrible fact that in war, the boundaries between foolishness and genius were often only a matter of support and timing. She left the square, as she always had, with her hands empty of weapons, but full of memory. The next morning would bring new teachings, new students, and new tests of the lessons she had lived. The white scarf, folded into the pocket of an old coat, would stay there as a reminder of the day when what looked like the dumbest move in the world had, with awful precision and necessary coordination, ended an entire enemy attack. She kept teaching. That, more than medals or interviews, held most of her days. 3 hours at the municipal hall for the younger recruits, 2 for the mid-career instructors who wanted to test an idea, 1 afternoon a week spent with the historians who catalogued the diagrams. The lessons were never the same twice, because the people who came were never the same twice. Some arrived with rage pressed into their faces like a hand. Others with a calm so brittle it sounded like glass when they moved. She met them all as if each class were a small covenant, a promise that she would tell what she knew honestly, and that they would listen without the flattery that turns hazard into legend. Her notebooks were thin now at the spine from being opened and closed. The pages were stained in places with the weather of a life, tea, rain, the smudge of an inked finger. And in one margin she had once drawn a tiny, crude crosshair, and, beneath it, the single word, attention. Students loved that drawing because it reduced something sprawling to a single hard sign. They took photographs of the sketch with their phones and posted them for each other with jokes in the caption. She did not mind that. The idea traveled more usefully when it shed solemnity. It reached the places solemnity could not. That morning, after the walk through the square, she found a note attached to the pocket of her coat, where the white scarf lay folded. The handwriting was quick, like a hand trying to catch up with thought. It read simply, "We used it." No name. Her first impulse was caution. Somewhere, someone might have used the scarf as a talisman and then thrown it away. But then she remembered the young woman in the corridor, the scrap of cloth, the way a gesture can be both continuity and admonition. She kept the note and the scarf together and put both in the drawer with the diagrams she thought of as small and stoic. The training that week turned on visibility. She began with a story. Not the photograph story again, not the famous attic shot, but a narrower thing. The afternoon a messenger misread a marker and walked into a lane that had been assumed clear. It was boring on paper, a wrong assumption, a failure of communication, a man who took a step where he should not have. But when she spoke the names and the room shifted. Faces leaned forward because the story sat on the hinge between fate and decision. It showed how a single misread could unmake months of planning. "Never treat a line on paper as if it were a border in the world," she said. "A line is a plan. People cross it." She drew arcs on the blackboard. Her hand moved slow and certain. The board smelled faintly of chalk and dust, the way old classrooms do. And outside the window a tram rattled its indifferent course down a repaired street. The students watched the lines become geometry, angles of sight, cones of fire, fields of concealment. She insisted on the language of measures, degrees, timings, pauses. It was not to deny the human cost. It was to make decisions legible so that other lives might be less exposed to the accidental. One of the newer instructors, arms long and a mouth quicker than her thought, raised a question. "We teach tight rules," he said. "We drill them in. But what about improvisation? The moment demands it sometimes. If you make the soldiers follow the manuals, they freeze." She did not answer him sharply. Instead, she walked to the corner of the room and pulled open a drawer. From it she took a folded page, the diagram from the attic mission, the one half sketched in the time between orders. "This," she said, handing it to him, "is improvisation mapped. The difference between a free move and a reckless one is that the first has already asked the room to absorb it." He frowned and turned the paper over, as if the act of reading could alter its meaning. "You do not teach improvisation by saying act. You teach it by teaching the framework into which those acts fit." He listened, and the room breathed a little more evenly. People learned to prefer frameworks to slogans. They practiced the discipline of watching not just what happened, but who could carry a decision and who could not. The moral calculus, how much risk to expose, how probable a saving move could be, wasn't a thing to be sanitized. It was a thing to be argued over at apprenticeship tables and revised when the facts of a new cityscape demanded it. After class, a woman lingered, hands clasped to a thermos like a relic. Her face was young enough that the life she carried in memory might have been a single event, a raid, a night of smoke, but old enough to be marked by the kind of tiredness that settles into a jaw. "I owe someone that night," she said. "We were told to cover a lane. We didn't. I thought I could do both. People died." The teacher sat with her at the back table and let her tell the night in 2 sentences and halting gestures. There were images. A lamplight struck, a child's hand grabbing a sleeve, a shout that arrived too late. There was regret thick enough to taste. The teacher did not give quick absolution. She asked where the orders had been written, how they had been rehearsed, what the watch rotations had been. The woman spoke. The teacher asked another question. The woman answered. The exchange was not charitable. It was methodical. As they spoke, the woman grew less like someone wanting to be forgiven and more like someone wanting to be useful. Sometimes the usefulness arrived in small ceremonial acts.
A local archive organized an evening where the original attic diagram would be displayed in a glass case. Attendance was modest: a few veterans, some of her students, a man who cataloged artifacts as if they were bones that needed to be numbered. They dimmed the lights. The diagram sat under a hush, and the photograph of the white scarf lay beside it like a simple stain of whiteness. A younger veteran, rough-haired and sleeveless, stood before the glass and said, with an echo of bravado that had been tired into something truer by experience, "I used to call that the dumbest move, too. Then I read the notes." He turned to the teacher, and there was gratitude in his eyes, not for what she'd done, no one asked for praise, but for what she had taught, the humility of admitting plans are partial, and the responsibility of trying to fill the gaps left by uncertainty. Not every classroom conversation softened into understanding. There were heated arguments, too, about whether the diagrams encouraged risk, whether the very act of making the attic move into a template made it attractive to those who had not the reserve to carry it. In one evening meeting, a man who had lost a brother in the lane accused her of turning a tragedy into a tool. The accusation landed like a stone. She listened. Listening was her hardest discipline. People wanted answers that fixed the past into absolutes. She knew such answers were impossible. She reminded them, gently but firmly, that tragedy resists simple attribution. She did not deny wrongness. "I have said before," she told the room, "that no move can be reduced to praise. No single man can hold the world's mistakes alone. But neither can we allow fear of blame to make us refuse to learn from the dead." A few months later, a district far to the south requested a consultation. Word had spread that a small set of principals reduced collateral mistakes, where lines intersected with civilian routes. The district's commander, a woman with a sympathetic scar along one cheek, arrived with plans and with a map that smelled faintly of smoke. They met in the municipal hall for 3 days. She explained the diagrams. The commander explained the specificities of her streets. They argued about cameras and about volunteer lookouts and about how to mark avenues so that traders and soldiers could both be safe without turning markets into fortresses.
At night, in the borrowed room where she slept on a narrow cot, she thought of the boy who had once asked her about regret. How each of them, teacher, commander, former boy, lived with the problem in a private way. She thought of the families who had learned to read the city by the scars in its walls, and she thought of the days when the maps had been smudged by tears and smoke. Probability sat beside love and waste like 3 rough neighbors who never spoke but always watched each other's windows. On the last day of the consultation, the commander gave her an envelope. Inside were photographs from a long-ago action, angles, faces, a hand reaching for a child, and a note that said, "We used your diagrams. We adapted them. We saved 3 lives." The teacher folded the note and put it into the drawer with the scarf and the other paper relics. A lightness that felt almost like relief passed through her. It did not absolve. It was only an instance where the work, in a small way, had met its aim. Even so, the nights were not easy. She would wake at odd hours with the city's sounds bleeding in through her window, the distant train, the low murmur of a neighbor's radio, and a face would appear unbidden, the shape of someone she had been unable to save, the expression of a person caught by error. These were not dramatic memories. They were small, precise accusations, an arched eyebrow that asked why what had been planned had been inadequate, a child's foot that did not step again. She would sit up, hold herself the way one holds a stubbornness, and name the facts. Naming was a way of refusing the false sanctity of a single explanation. A year passed. New instructors circulated the drawings and added notes in different handwritings, small amendments that read like conversations across time. A young man from one of her earliest classes became an instructor in another district. He wrote to her once in a letter that smelled faintly of factory paper. They call the attic move reckless in the press. In our classes, we call it the ledger now. We teach both the move and the cost. It sits heavy, but it is honest. She wrote back and told him to teach the ledger as if it were a balance sheet, one on which both costs and benefits had to be recorded and weighed. Sometimes she feared that the ledger itself would ossify into yet another kind of ritual, an excuse for men to call luck into being by naming it, a page on which risk could be ritualized until its danger dulled into routine. She guarded against that by refusing any ceremony that edged toward glamour. When a local school asked for her to speak at a celebration of veterans, she declined the speech they wanted, glossed, heroic, clean, and instead asked for a plain hour with a group of teens. "Ask me anything," she told them. "I will answer honestly." They had, for the most part, reasonable questions. What did fear feel like? How did you keep going? Was the white scarf lucky? She answered. Her answers were small, exact, and sometimes blunt. One girl asked if she ever wanted a different life. She said yes, and then said that the life she had chosen had given her a set of obligations she could not unchoose. The girl listened as if she were learning a skill. On a damp morning, a man with a camera came to the hall and asked for an interview. He wanted to make a short film about the diagrams and the scarf. She refused at first. She had given away many interviews. She found that the retelling on camera tended to flatten nuance into a tidy moral. Eventually, she consented for a small reason. The man's father had been at the municipal collection one day and had told him, in a way that suggested gratitude without praise, that the diagrams had kept his daughter walking home through a formerly dangerous lane. The teacher agreed to a brief segment, not because she liked being recorded, but because she trusted the man's intention. They filmed in the hall. He set up a single chair and asked her to sit. The light fell across the paper edges and made the chalk dust visible in the air like a small constellation. She spoke quietly, and the camera took what she said without comment. After a few minutes, she stood up and asked for the attic diagram to be shown. The camera moved over it, lingered on the crosshair she had drawn, and then pulled back. The man thanked her and left. She returned the drawing to its folder and locked the drawer. There was no thrill in being seen. There was a sense of work compiled. Evenings were for keeping friends. The teacher had a small circle. People who had known war in ways that were not theatrical. A midwife who had tended night births during curfews. An electrician who had once rerouted power lines to keep a hospital lit. A baker who had fed soup to soldiers and civilians on the same day. They met at the baker's shop and argued about small things. Recipes, whether a city could be taught to be kinder, whether children could be kept from learning violence's geometry. The arguments were sometimes comic, sometimes raw. They ended by walking home together through streets that had been resculpted by repair crews, under lights that blinked like tired, practical stars. One evening, as they were leaving, a group of children played in the square where she had once stood and touched the cartwheel. They chased one another through the pattern of a temporary fountain, squealing, throwing their limbs wide. She watched, and her chest tightened and then softened. A little boy tripped and fell, scraped his knee, and one of the older children ran to pick him up. No one cried. The smallness of the accident was a kind of miracle. It did not erase what had been lost. It layered the city with additional life. That night she wrote a short note and slipped it into the drawer next to the scarf. It read, "We teach not to make heroes, but to make fewer funerals." She folded the paper and let the drawer breathe shut. In the weeks that followed, word came that a memorial would be placed in the square. Not a statue, she insisted when asked, but a low plaque with the names of those lost in the lines that had intersected with civilian life. The municipal council debated the script. There were arguments about what to inscribe, about whether the plaque should include diagrams or only names. She urged them to include one sentence beyond the names. for those who keep count. They looked at her as if she had suggested something both austere and necessary. They agreed. On the morning of the unveiling, the city felt as if it had put on a clean shirt. The square filled with people who had once been strangers to one another, but had been stitched together by memory into the rough fabric of a neighborhood. Veterans stood at the edge, hands folded, watching their own pasts made public in a way they had not requested, but that the living needed. She kept quiet, as she always did in such moments, because publicity turned things into icons, and icons tended to do violence to nuance. After the ceremony, a man came up to her. He was not young. His hair had gone the color of smoke. He held in his hand a photograph that had been folded many times. When he opened it, she recognized the angle, the attic shot, the white scarf visible like a small moon at the edge. He looked at her and said simply, "My son told me to bring this." He did not ask for anything. He did not say he forgave. He simply offered the image as if to say that memory travels in many hands. She accepted the photograph and then, without thinking, reached into her coat and found the white scarf in the pocket. She had not known she would do it. She unfolded it and pressed it into the man's hands. For a moment his face changed. Confusion, then something like a release. "Take it," she said. "Keep it with you. Not as a charm, but as a ledger of what we owe one another." He bowed as if in gratitude. Around them the square murmured, a city conversing in its own minor languages. She stepped back and watched the children climb a low wall and leap down, a small, ordinary act of courage. The plaque in the square caught the light, and the names glowed briefly. There would be more classes, more arguments, more nights when the diagrams were redrawn to fit new streets. There would be letters and small victories and the persistent. There would also be, she hoped, the slow accretion of fewer funerals. For now, she walked home with a sense that the ledger had been carried a little further, that the city's geometry had been nudged toward less harm by the hard, practical habit of attention. She slept that night with the city murmuring beyond the glass, and woke with the plans for the next week's lesson already forming like a constellation, arcs to be drawn, questions to ask, names to be kept from being only names on a stone. The white scarf, returned to its drawer, lay above the paper where she had written, "We teach not to make heroes, but to make fewer funerals." Her hand rested for a moment on the wood, and then she rose to prepare for the morning, the diagrams, the students who would arrive and ask, in some fashion, how to hold a move that might save rather than squander. Outside, the square entered into its ordinary routine. The tram bell, the baker loading loaves, children following each other like small examinant satellites around a planet of patched roofs. The teacher closed the drawer and locked it. The city kept turning. The ledger kept growing. She walked toward the hall and the day, and the small geometry of consequence took its place again in the work of living.